Santo Amaro da Purificação, Bahia, Brazil, August 1716. When Portuguese authorities finally breached the doors of the Engenho São Gabriel sugar mill, they found the furnace still burning. The heat was so intense that soldiers had to retreat twice before they could approach close enough to see what fueled the flames. Inside the cast-iron chamber, designed to burn bagasse and wood to boil sugar cane juice, they discovered human remains. 14 bodies, or what was left of them. The bones were so thoroughly incinerated that identification became impossible. But the mill's account books, miraculously untouched by the fire, provided the investigators with names. All 14 victims were plantation owners, wealthy men who controlled thousands of acres of sugar cane and the labor of over 300 enslaved Africans and indigenous people. Men who had gathered at Engenho São Gabriel for their monthly consortium meeting where they discussed prices, labor management, and how to maximize profits from the brutal sugar economy that was making Portugal wealthy beyond measure. The investigation that followed revealed something that shook colonial Brazil to its foundations. The massacre hadn't been random violence or a slave uprising gone wrong. It had been methodical, planned, executed with precision by a single woman whose name appeared in the mill's records only as property, Esperanza de Lima, purchased from a slave ship in 1710, listed as field laborer, valued at 400 milreis. The woman who had served these men for 6 years before feeding them, one by one, into the furnace that represented everything the sugar economy had built. Before we continue with the story of Esperanza and the night of flames that would be suppressed from Brazilian history for over 2 centuries, we need you to join this community. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, deliberately erased by those who feared what they represented, deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know where our truth seekers are gathering. What happened at Engenho São Gabriel didn't begin with fire. It began 6 years earlier with chains and a ship's hold that smelled of death. The sugar plantations of colonial Brazil represented one of history's most profitable and most brutal economic systems. By 1716, Brazil was producing over 15,000 tons of sugar annually, nearly 80% of the world's supply. This wealth was built on a foundation of human suffering so extreme that the average life expectancy for an enslaved person working in the sugar fields was 7 years. 7 years from arrival to death. The work was that hard. The conditions were that deadly. The masters were that cruel. The process of sugar production required enormous amounts of labor. The cane had to be cut by hand in fields where heat could reach 110 degrees. The cut cane had to be transported immediately to the mill before the juice spoiled. The juice had to be extracted using massive rollers that crushed the cane and frequently crushed the workers who fed it into the machinery. The extracted juice had to be boiled in a series of copper kettles over furnaces that burned day and night, creating temperatures that made the mills feel like depictions of hell rendered in physical space. Workers died constantly, from heat exhaustion, from accidents with the machinery, from infections that festered in the tropical climate, from malnutrition because feeding enslaved people adequately cut into profit margins, from punishments designed to terrorize others into compliance. The death rate was so high that plantation owners calculated the cost of replacement rather than the cost of better treatment. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy new ones than to keep them alive longer. Into this system, in March 1710, came a woman who would be recorded in the ship's manifest as simply female, approximately 20 years, Congo region, healthy specimen, no visible defects. She was one of 312 Africans packed into the hold of the Nossa Senhora de Conceição, a slave ship making its 4th crossing from Angola to Bahia. Of the 470 people who had been forced aboard in Luanda, 158 died during the crossing. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony, feeding sharks that learned to follow the slave ships. The woman who would become Esperanza de Lima survived the crossing, though survival was relative. She arrived in Salvador weighing perhaps 80 pounds, covered in sores from lying in her own waste for 8 weeks, traumatized beyond what any human mind should have to endure. She was marched with the other survivors to the slave market, where buyers examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscles, looking for workers who might survive long enough to justify the purchase price. She was bought by a sugar consortium that operated several mills in the Santo Amaro region. The buyer was acting on behalf of Senor Antonio Ribeiro da Silva, who owned Engenho São Gabriel and served as the consortium's leader. She was branded with the mill's mark, a stylized S burned into her left shoulder, permanent proof of ownership. She was given the name Esperanza, which meant hope in Portuguese, a cruel joke given what awaited her. The surname de Lima indicated she belonged to the Lima family holdings, though the Limas had sold their share to Ribeiro 2 years earlier, and the name lingered only in the property records. Esperanza was assigned to the boiling house, considered one of the worst positions in the entire sugar production process. The boiling house was where the extracted cane juice was transformed into crystallized sugar through a series of increasingly hot copper kettles. The heat was unbearable. The steam was constant. The risk of being scalded by boiling sugar, which stuck to skin and burned through to bone, was ever present. Workers in the boiling house typically died within 3 years. But Esperanza didn't die. She survived through a combination of physical resilience, careful observation, and something else. Something the overseers occasionally noticed, but couldn't quite articulate. A quality of patient watchfulness, a sense that she was studying everything around her with an intelligence that made some of them uncomfortable, though they couldn't explain why a piece of property's intelligence should matter. The boiling house at Engenho São Gabriel operated 24 hours a day during the harvest season, which ran from July through December. Workers were divided into shifts, each shift consisting of 8 hours of labor so intense that many collapsed by the end. Esperanza worked the night shift from midnight until 8 in the morning, when the mill was quieter and the overseers less attentive. She learned the rhythm of the furnace, how much fuel it required to maintain the precise temperatures needed for each stage of sugar crystallization, how the drafts had to be adjusted to control the flame, how the ash had to be removed and the grates cleaned to prevent the fire from smothering itself. She became, over months and then years, perhaps the most skilled furnace operator at the mill, able to judge temperature by sight and sound, able to keep the boilers at exactly the right heat for maximum efficiency. The overseers praised her work in the casual way they might praise a well-functioning tool. Senor Ribeiro himself once commented, during a tour of the mill for potential investors, that the African woman at the furnace was worth twice what he'd paid because she never let the fire die or burn too hot. She'd saved him thousands of milrays in wasted fuel and spoiled sugar. He was pleased with his property. What none of them understood was that Esperanza was learning something beyond sugar production. She was learning the architecture of the mill itself, the layout of the buildings, the schedule of the guards, the patterns of the owner's visits, the locations of every lock, every door, every exit. She was learning how to move through the complex invisibly, using the servants' passages and work areas that the white owners never entered because such spaces were beneath their notice. She was also learning about the 14 men who controlled the consortium. Once a month, on the last Thursday, the plantation owners gathered at Engenho São Gabriel for their consortium meeting. They would arrive in the afternoon, their carriages pulled by horses that ate better than the enslaved people who grew their wealth. They would dine together in the main house, consuming food prepared by the household slaves, drinking wine imported from Portugal, discussing the business of sugar with the casual cruelty of men for whom human suffering was merely a line item in an account book. After dinner, they would adjourn to the mill itself to inspect the operations. This was partly business, ensuring their investment was being managed properly, but it was also performance, a ritual display of mastery over the industrial machinery that transformed nature and human labor into profit. They would walk through the boiling house in their fine clothes, pointing at the workers, commenting on efficiency rates, discussing whether the current death rate was acceptable or if they should pressure the crown to increase slave ship arrivals. Esperanza served them during these visits. She was one of several enslaved people assigned to attend the consortium meetings, bringing refreshments, stoking the furnace for demonstration purposes, standing silently while the owners discussed their lives as if they were discussing cattle or agricultural equipment. She listened to everything. She learned that Senor Ribeiro had ordered the execution of 3 workers the previous month for suspected theft of sugar, though no evidence was ever presented. She learned that Senor Carvalho, who owned the neighboring mill, had burned the feet of a field worker who had tried to run away, then forced the man to continue cutting cane while the burns festered. She learned that Senor Mendez had purchased a woman specifically for breeding purposes, planning to sell her children to other plantations once they were old enough to work. She learned that these men saw themselves as civilized, as Christians, as representatives of Portuguese enlightenment bringing order to a savage land. They spoke of the enslaved people as natural slaves, inferior beings who required the discipline of bondage to prevent them from descending into chaos. They quoted scripture to justify their cruelty. They convinced themselves that they were doing God's work, and Esperanza began to plan their deaths. The decision didn't come suddenly. It emerged gradually over years of accumulated rage and careful calculation. She understood that killing slave owners was suicide. She would be caught. She would be executed in the most painful way Portuguese law allowed, probably burned alive herself as an example to others who might consider rebellion. Her death was guaranteed. But Esperanza had already died. She died in the hold of the ship that brought her here. She died every day for 6 years in the boiling house. Her body continued functioning, but the person she had been in Congo, whoever that woman was, had been destroyed so thoroughly that nothing remained except purpose. She would kill these men, then she would die, but at least she would die having struck a blow against the system that had consumed so many lives without consequence. The question was method. A single enslaved woman couldn't fight 14 men, especially men who carried pistols and swords and were protected by armed overseers. She couldn't poison them all simultaneously. She couldn't attack them physically. She needed something that would allow her to kill them methodically, one by one or in small groups, before the others realized what was happening. She needed the furnace. Esperanza began her final preparations in July 1716, at the start of the harvest season. The mill was operating at maximum capacity. The furnace burned constantly. The boiling house was chaos, with workers coming and going at all hours, supervisors focused on production quotas, everyone too busy to notice details like extra fuel stockpiled in unusual locations or modifications to the furnace's draft system that would allow it to burn even hotter than normal. She studied the layout of the main house, where the consortium meetings were held. She identified the route from the dining room to the mill, a covered walkway that protected the owners from rain during their inspections. She noticed that this walkway had doors at both ends, heavy doors with locks, doors that could be secured from the outside. She collected rope, not all at once, which would be noticed, but piece by piece over weeks, taking a length here, a scrap there, hiding them in the ash pit beneath the furnace where no one ever looked because the work of cleaning ash was delegated to the lowest workers. She acquired a knife. Not stolen, which would be discovered, but salvaged from the trash heap behind the carpentry shop. A broken blade that she sharpened on the furnace's stone foundation during her shift, when the noise of the machinery masked the sound of steel on stone, and she waited for the July consortium meeting. The meeting took place on July 26, 1716, a Thursday that dawned clear and hot, even by Brazilian standards. The 14 plantation owners arrived throughout the afternoon, their carriages forming a line outside the main house. Their drivers, all enslaved men, were directed to the servants' quarters where they would wait, sometimes for hours, until the meetings concluded. Esperanza worked her usual shift in the boiling house. She'd volunteered for extra hours, claiming she wanted to ensure the furnace was properly prepared for the evening inspection. The overseer was pleased by this display of dedication. He didn't notice that Esperanza had been feeding the furnace more fuel than necessary, building the temperature higher than normal operations required, creating a roaring inferno that made the entire building shimmer with heat. The consortium dinner concluded around 8 in the evening. The 14 men emerged from the main house in excellent spirits, full of food and wine, joking with each other about profits and production, ready to inspect the mill and discuss expansion plans. They entered the covered walkway that led from the house to the boiling house, their fine shoes clicking on the wooden floor. Esperanza was waiting. She'd positioned herself at the mill entrance, ostensibly to open the doors for the gentleman. As the last owner entered the walkway, she closed the main house door behind him and locked it. The sound of the lock engaging was lost in the noise of the mill machinery. The 14 men continued down the walkway, unaware that they were now trapped between two locked doors. They reached the mill entrance where Esperanza stood, and she opened that door for them, bowing with the submissiveness expected of enslaved people. "Good evening, señores," she said quietly. "The furnace is prepared for your inspection." They entered the boiling house. The heat struck them immediately, far more intense than any previous visit. Several men loosened their collars. Señor Ribeiro commented that the African woman had built the fire too hot, that she'd need to be disciplined for wasting fuel. "Yes, señor," Esperanza replied. "I built it very hot tonight, for a special purpose." Before they could process what she meant, Esperanza pulled the mill door closed and locked it from the inside. Then she moved with practiced speed to the emergency exit that led to the cane fields, locked that as well, and dropped both keys into the furnace's roaring interior where they would melt within seconds. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror at Engenho São Gabriel reaches its terrible climax. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark histories. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because what Esperanza was about to do would be suppressed from history books for over 2 centuries. The 14 plantation owners stood in the locked boiling house, confusion turning to alarm as they realized their situation. Señor Ribeiro approached Esperanza, his face reddening with anger that wasn't entirely from the heat. "What is the meaning of this? Open those doors immediately." "No, señor," Esperanza said simply. The word hung in the air. Number. A word enslaved people were never permitted to speak to their masters. A word that represented complete inversion of the social order these men had built their lives maintaining. "You dare refuse me?" Ribeiro's hand moved toward the pistol he carried, but Esperanza was faster. The salvaged knife, sharpened over weeks on stone, slid between his ribs with the precision of someone who had butchered countless animals for the consortium's feasts. Ribeiro dropped without a sound. The other 13 men backed away, their wine-slowed minds trying to process what was happening. Several reached for their own weapons, but the boiling house was Esperanza's territory. She knew every shadow, every piece of equipment, every place where the steam was thick enough to conceal movement. She knew the building was designed with worker efficiency in mind, which meant minimal space between the boilers and equipment, places where men in fine clothes would struggle to maneuver while she moved with practiced ease. What followed was methodical. Esperanza hunted the plantation owners through their own mill, using the machinery they'd installed, the furnace they'd built, the industrial efficiency they'd demanded. She used the boiling kettles, pushing men into the 300-degree sugar that clung to skin and burned through to bone. She used the rollers, the massive machines that crushed cane, proving they could crush other things as well when necessary, and she used the furnace. The furnace that had been the center of her existence for 6 years. The furnace she knew more intimately than anything else in the world. She dragged the bodies, and in some cases the living but incapacitated men, to its opening, and she fed them into the flames. The process took nearly 4 hours. 4 hours of hunting, killing, and burning. 4 hours during which the other workers in the mill heard the screams but couldn't see what was happening in the boiling house. 4 hours during which the overseers tried to approach but were driven back by the heat and by Esperanza's knife when they got too close. By midnight, it was finished. 14 plantation owners had entered the boiling house. None would leave it alive. Their bones were reduced to ash. Their weapons melted. Their fine clothes consumed. Everything they were had been fed into the furnace that represented the system they'd built. Esperanza emerged from the boiling house covered in blood and ash. The other workers stared at her in absolute silence. She'd done what was impossible, what was unthinkable. She'd killed the masters, all of them. She'd destroyed the consortium that controlled the sugar economy of the entire region. An elderly man named João, who had survived 20 years in the sugar fields despite all odds, finally spoke. "What have you done?" "What was necessary," Esperanza replied. Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "They consumed our lives. I consumed theirs." "They'll kill us all for this," João whispered. "They'll burn every enslaved person on this plantation as punishment." "Then run," Esperanza said. "The doors are open." The overseers are confused. You have hours before they organize a response. Run. Some of you will die, but some of you might survive, might reach the quilombos in the interior, might find freedom. She was right. The overseers, when they finally understood what had happened, focused their attention on Esperanza. She didn't resist arrest. She stood calmly as they chained her, as they dragged her to the punishment post, as they prepared her for execution. She had accomplished what she'd set out to do. The rest didn't matter. But while the overseers were focused on Esperanza, nearly half the enslaved workers at Engenho São Gabriel ran. They disappeared into the cane fields, into the forest, into the night. Some were recaptured, some were killed, but some reached the quilombos, the communities of escaped slaves hidden in Brazil's interior. They carried with them the story of the woman who burned 14 masters alive. Esperanza de Lima was executed on July 28, 1716, 2 days after the massacre. The Portuguese authorities decided against burning her alive, fearing it would create symbolic connection to her crime. Instead, she was hanged publicly in Santo Amaro's central square. Hundreds of enslaved people were forced to watch. The execution designed as a lesson about what happened to those who raised their hands against masters. Esperanza died without speaking, without begging, without showing fear. Witnesses reported that she looked almost peaceful as the rope was placed around her neck, as if death was a release rather than a punishment. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave. Her name was ordered stricken from all official records. The Portuguese colonial government classified the massacre as a labor incident rather than what it actually was. The families of the dead plantation owners received compensation from the Crown. The consortium was dissolved and its properties sold to new owners who instituted even stricter security measures to prevent similar incidents, and the story was suppressed. For over 200 years, the official histories of colonial Brazil rarely mentioned Esperanza de Lima. When the massacre was discussed at all, it was described as a slave uprising, the work of multiple people rather than a single woman. The details were deliberately obscured. The furnace was dismantled. The boiling house was eventually torn down. Every physical trace of what happened that night was systematically erased. But the story survived in oral tradition. Among the descendants of enslaved people, among the Quilombo communities, the tale of Esperanza was passed down through generations. She became a folk legend, the woman of fire, the furnace keeper who fed the masters to the flames. The details changed with each telling, embroidered with mythology and symbolism, but the core remained constant. A woman who struck back against the system that had consumed so many lives. The first written account of Esperanza's story didn't appear until 1924, when a Brazilian historian named Paulo Santos discovered references to the massacre in Portuguese colonial archives. Santos spent 5 years researching the incident, piecing together evidence from plantation records, court documents, and the oral histories preserved in Afro-Brazilian communities. His book, A Mulher da Fornalha, Resistência Escrava, no Brasil Colonial, The Woman of the Furnace, Slave Resistance in Colonial Brazil, was published in 1929. The book was immediately controversial. Conservative historians argued that Santos had exaggerated or invented details, that he'd relied too heavily on folklore rather than documentary evidence, that he was promoting a dangerous narrative that glorified violence against property owners. Several Brazilian states banned the book. It remained out of print for decades, but Santos's research had opened a door. Other historians began investigating the massacre. More documents were discovered in Portuguese archives, including the coroner's report that described the 14 bodies found in the furnace, including the account books that identified Esperanza as the primary suspect. including testimony from surviving enslaved workers who described what they'd witnessed that night. Modern forensic analysis of the skeletal remains found during the 1967 demolition confirmed Santos's research. 14 adult males, showing evidence of traumatic injury and exposure to extreme heat. 1 adult female, approximately 25 to 30 years old at death, showing evidence of malnutrition and repetitive stress injuries consistent with plantation labor. The male skeletons were scattered and incomplete, consistent with being dismembered before burning. The female skeleton was complete, suggesting she died later and was buried rather than burned. The journals discovered alongside the remains proved to be the most valuable historical evidence. One journal, written in Portuguese, appeared to be a personal account by one of the plantation owners, possibly Ribeiro, documenting consortium meetings and plantation operations. The entries ended abruptly on July 26, 1716. The other journal was written in a mixture of Portuguese and Kikongo, the language of the Congo Kingdom. The handwriting was crude, suggesting someone who had learned to write without formal education. The entries were sparse, often just dates and single words, but the final entry, dated July 26, 1716, was longer. Translated, it read, "Tonight I feed them to the fire. Tonight I become fire. Tonight I burn away everything they built on our bodies. I will die, but they die first. That is enough." The journal was signed Esperanza, with the mark that had been branded on her shoulder drawn carefully beside her name. What happened at Engenho São Gabriel in July 1716 remains one of the most suppressed acts of resistance in Brazilian history. Not because the facts are uncertain, the evidence is overwhelming, but because what Esperanza did challenges comfortable narratives about slavery and resistance. Her actions weren't noble in the way history prefers its heroes to be noble. She didn't lead a philosophical movement or inspire others through words. She simply killed 14 men and burned their bodies in the furnace they'd used to build their wealth. Historians remain divided about how to interpret Esperanza's actions. Some see her as a revolutionary, striking against the system of slavery through the only means available to her. Others see her as a tragic figure driven to madness by unbearable circumstances. Still others focus on the complexity of her choices, the moral ambiguity of using the oppressor's own machinery of death against them. What's undeniable is that Esperanza's story reveals truths about slavery that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. The system wasn't maintained through consent or even through simple economic exploitation. It was maintained through terror, through daily violence so extreme that it numbed both victims and perpetrators, through the reduction of human beings to property, to tools, to fuel for an economic engine that consumed lives without counting the cost. Esperanza understood this system better than the men who claimed to control it. She understood that their power was built on her labor, on her knowledge, on her ability to keep the furnace burning. She understood that the same industrial efficiency they demanded from her could be turned against them. She understood that in a system built on dehumanization, reclaiming humanity might require inhuman actions. The sugar economy of colonial Brazil continued for another century after Esperanza's death. Millions more Africans would be transported across the Atlantic. Millions more would die in the fields and mills and furnaces. The system was too profitable to abandon simply because one woman had struck back against it. But the story of what happened at Engenho São Gabriel spread throughout the plantation regions. Slave owners began to fear their furnace operators. They installed additional locks. They increased surveillance. They recognized, however reluctantly, that the people they'd reduced to property still retained the capacity for resistance. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to do so. The abolition came not from moral awakening, but from economic calculation and enslaved people's constant resistance. People like Esperanza, whose names were suppressed, whose actions were erased, whose very existence was inconvenient for the narratives that powerful people preferred to tell. Today, on the site where Engenho São Gabriel once stood, there's a small memorial. It was erected in 2016, 300 years after the massacre. A simple stone marker with Esperanza's name and the words "Ela recusou," she refused. Every year on July 26th, descendants of enslaved people gather there to remember the woman who fed 14 plantation owners to the furnace, and in doing so reminded the world that no system of oppression is permanent, that resistance is always possible, that sometimes the oppressed strike back with a fury that burns away everything in its path. What do you think of Esperanza's story? Do you believe her actions were justified? Leave your comment below. If you found this story compelling and want more hidden histories brought to light, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear stories that history tried to erase. The darkest chapters of the past are often the ones we've been taught to forget, but at Liturgy of Fear, we believe they deserve to be remembered. See you in the next video.